Okay, I'm back. Back to continue and to complete our discussion on evolution. We've left off with the idea of artificial selection. And we get now back to our sort of four mechanisms that generate the evolutionary process, right? So we talked about mutations already. We've looked at selection, the two major divisions, natural selection and artificial selection. And then also under natural selection, we had a subdivision of sexual selection. So again, mutation, a direct change to the DNA, may be neutral, may be good, may be bad, depending on the situation the organism finds itself in. Selection, again, natural, can be generated by humans, domestication, selective breeding for artificial selection. So now we get into a little bit more, I would say we got to get into a little bit more depth into our gene pool to understand our idea of gene flow and genetic drift. So these are, again, the last two mechanisms of evolution, right? So first we look at the gene pool. So the gene pool is defined as the sum of all the alleles in a population. Okay, not some of the alleles, the sum of all the alleles. So in this gene pool, right, gene pool defined by the researcher, by the evolutionary theorist, it could be all of the butterflies in a field, all of the fish in a lake, all of the fleas on a dog, all of the fish in a tank, right? All of the potential alleles, dominant, recessive alleles, in this case, the homozygous recessive condition leading to a yellow butterfly, or I should say a white butterfly, homozygous dominant to a dark reddish butterfly, the heterozygous condition, kind of a mix of the both, for orange, right? So we have each individual butterfly and their two alleles for wing color in this case, right? So that is what evolution would work upon, the gene pool, right? We talked about this in an earlier slide, that evolution doesn't happen at the individual level, at the organismal level, it happens at the populational level. And this is where we're talking about, right? And I don't know if you've worked already in lab with the Hardy-Weinberg concept and calculating the P's and the Q's and all that, the allele frequency. Well, that is the basis for population genetics, the basis for evolution, working on the gene pool here, right? All the potential alleles in a population. So a single individual only has some of the alleles in the population. For example, you may have brown eyes. So you don't have blue eyes, you don't have green eyes, you have brown eyes. But you may be carrying the blue eye allele, right? You maybe somebody in your family had green eyes. Whatever height you are, you may be, maybe if we look back in your family history, you may have a very tall individual, or maybe a little person in your family, genetic, family tree. So the individual contains only some of the alleles found in the entire population. Right? The gene pool contains the variation that produces the different phenotypes on which the agents of evolution act. So the different phenotypes, the physical appearances, right? Different skin color, different heights, different hair colors, different blood types, right? Those are the phenotypes on which the agents of evolution, mutation, selection, gene flow, and genetic drift would act. So it might be a random sort of coupling. It may be a selective situation where, let's say, maybe this is the better adapted gene composition, allele composition. So maybe they're the ones that are going to have a better chance of passing on. Or maybe this is the combination that's sickly and produces some sort of genetic disease, right? So within the context of the entire population, those are the individuals that can, combine, reproduce, and then their alleles will interact in the next generation. Okay, so our third, number three, our third mechanism of evolution we call gene flow. Right? In order to understand gene flow, we have to have an understanding of the gene pool and different populations. So gene flow occurs when individuals migrate to another population and breed in that new location. So we say it's migration followed by reproduction. So let's say you took a trip to, I don't know, you wanted to go see the Eiffel Tower in Paris, right? So you went, you took pictures, you came back. You went to a new population and you came back. If nothing else happened, that is not gene flow, right? Let's say you wanted to go see the Great Wall of China, right? You went to the Great Wall, you took pictures, you came back with souvenirs, nothing else happened. That is not gene flow. But let's say you went to go visit the Great Wall of China. You went from the El Paso population to China right now. And in that population, you had a lot of fun, right? You made a good impression on a certain someone. There was a reproductive event, and there is a child now as a product of that reproductive event. So that would then be considered gene flow. Individuals moving from one population to another, distinctive in their own. It may not be distinctive. It can be kind of similar, but it's a different population separated by some boundary, be it a political boundary, be it a geographic boundary. So individuals migrate to a new population, a different population, and then breed in that location. That is gene flow. So if today we magically went to Central Africa, right? If we took a population from El Paso to Central Africa, we notice that there's a lot of difference in the gene pool. If we magically went to Scandinavia, right, we would see a difference in gene pool. If we went to, I don't know, northern Alaska to the sort of Inuit tribe up there somewhere, right? So we would see a lot of differences in our populations. So the immigrants, the people traveling to the new population, may add new alleles. Right? So if we go to Scandinavia, we're going to add a lot of dark hair, dark skin, dark eye alleles to that population. Or there may already be some dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin in Scandinavia, but by us taking a classroom full of students over there, we may change the frequencies, make it more likely to see these genes there, right? The actual number, the frequency, the percentage, we would change the probabilities of an interaction producing in a brown-eyed, brown-haired, or dark-haired, brown-skinned individual, right? So a major gene flow event took place in 1492, if you know your history, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. They didn't teach you that little rhyme in school, maybe yes, maybe no. But if we can go back in time to 1492, if we were to analyze modern, or I should say, if we were to analyze Cuba, Hispaniola, that in that area, the Bahamas, if we were to analyze these individuals in 1492, the native peoples that were there in 1492, they would not look like what we would see today, right? Today, Cuba has a big influx of sort of African population. So in 1492, there would have been a different population that Columbus would have encountered, right? It would have been stereotypically Native American, dark, straight hair, dark skin, dark eyes, relatively short and stout. The European population would have been a little bit lighter skin, maybe curly hair, a lot of body hair, a little bit taller, maybe lighter colored eyes. So we would have had two distinct populations, Europe and the United States, separated by a huge geographical barrier. And in that time, Columbus came across, would have brought in new ideas, new culture, but a lot of new genes. And over time, there was then reproduction happening. So the new genes from Europe were being left behind here, And I suspect some individuals then started going across, so that we had then a gene flow event in both patterns. And today, in the year 2020, if you consider yourself Mexican American, Hispanic, Latino, Chicano, if you have some sort of shade of brown, right? Most likely you are the product of this gene flow event, right? Very few people in El Paso are like, you look truly like a Native American, right? You don't either look like a truly European, right? So most people in the El Paso area, most people in Mexico per se, are going to be in that mixture, right? We got genes from the European lineage and from the Native American lineage here in this gene flow event, right? And depending on what kind of genetic tests you do, if you do Ancestry.com, 23andMe, you might be able to trace back your genetic link, right? Or you trace back to Spain, maybe to France, to Italy, to to what European lineage, what European gene flow trajectory came across. Right? That's interesting genetic analysis that can be done. So today it's a little bit easier to travel, right? It takes a little bit of money, but you can get on a plane and fly across the world pretty fast. But in the old days, in Columbus time, right, you would have a very isolated sort of area, right? So we associate this red hair, green-eyed, Irish or Scottish type of phenotype, dark straight hair, sort of the slanted eyes would be then sort of stereotypical China, Japan, Central Africa, Western Africa, the dark-skinned individuals, curly hair. This is maybe potentially what Columbus may have encountered, right? Individuals from the Inca tribe, the Mayans, the Aztec populations, or those little sort of smaller, minor Native American populations that he would have encountered. So again, there are some people that still look like this today, maybe not with all the pageantry here, but again, most individuals, especially in the El Paso sort of border Texas area, are products of a gene flow event. And if we start to see more gene flow, this is one of your test questions, right? If we start to see more gene flow, if we make it real cheap flights from Scotland to I don't know, Peru, right? So real cheap flights from Scotland to Peru, and there's more and more travel, more and more mixing, more and more gene flow. Would we start to see those same differences, or would those differences kind of start to be minimized a little bit, right? If we start to have a lot of gene flow between, let's say, China and Africa, what would start to happen with the offspring? So the less gene flow, the greater the differences can exist. The more gene flow of all this mixing here, then the populations start to look similar and more similar. So gene flow having a big impact on physical appearances. We used to associate certain genetic cultures with certain diseases, genetic diseases. Now we start to see a lot of diseases that were maybe one race or one ethnic group sort of dominant. Now they're starting to be seen in different types of ethnic groups, right, because of gene flow events. So I hope that made sense. The last one that is a little bit tricky as well is the idea of genetic drift. Genetic drift, what makes this challenging is that it's the random loss of individuals and the alleles they possess, right? So random, this makes it challenging. If we're talking about natural selection, who would die in natural selection? The weak, the slow, right? Who would die in genetic drift? It's random, right? It's being at the wrong place at the wrong time, right? I don't know if you're fans of the Marvel character Thanos, right? So he had this big gauntlet, snapped his fingers, and who died, right? Who was removed, right? Half of the population. So was it the weak ones, the wimpy ones, the genetically flawed ones? Well, some of those, but there was also the really strong ones, some of the superheroes that were also killed. Right? So that's what genetic drift would do. It doesn't select the weak or the strong. It's just a random loss. We typically associate this randomness with a natural disaster. I don't care if you're a fast lizard or a slow lizard, you're not going to be able to outrun a whole volcanic eruption, right? Natural disasters, tsunamis, lightning strikes, big fires, things like this are typically going to take the life of well-adapted and not well-adapted individuals. And that's what we call genetic drift. So associated with genetic drift is the idea of a population bottleneck effect. So it occurs when only a small portion of a large population survives. So our population, our gene pool is very diverse. We have many different colors. Something happened, a catastrophic event, the volcano, the earthquake, the tsunami, something happened where most of the individuals died. They were at the wrong place at the wrong time. They got trapped, whatever. So only a few of them survived. Only the blue and the red survived. So they got to rebuild the population, right? And if they rebuild, well, they rebuild without all of the genetic variation that they had before. So the population starts to become a little bit more similar. The phenotypes don't have as much diversity, right? Product of a bottleneck effect under the concept of genetic drift. So bottleneck just because they're kind of passing through a little filter, almost a little small area, a lot of population being killed off, small, then having to inbreed and again, just losing a lot of that genetic variation in the bottleneck situation, the founder event. So again, we have a chance here about 50-50, where we see about half white, about half blue, and a very small percentage of yellow. After the population bottleneck effect, our population changed, right? We don't have yellow. Yellow was removed when extinct from this population. And we're no longer 50-50 blue to white. Now it's predominantly blue, a smaller amount of white. So kind of a theoretical or sort of way of explaining this, a picture way of seeing how we can lose diversity. And as these have to rebuild the population, well, there's we might have lost the good, strong ones. We might have lost the healthy ones, but they're the ones that would then reproduce to generate a bigger population in the future. A couple of well-known animals have gone through population bottleneck effects. Alligators, eagles, because of DDT, because of overhunting for the alligators, their population started to decrease, right? So alligator population decreased, eagle population decreased. Their numbers got quite small. So laws were set in place, chemicals were removed from, these pesticides were removed from farming and agriculture, and the species were then able to recover, right? So alligator populations increased, eagle populations increased, and that's good for them, but we noticed that they look very similar. They lost a lot of genetic variation within that bottleneck effect. Cheetahs, same thing. So cheetahs went through a bottleneck effect to such a degree they're in a small, they're in a tricky situation, a small population size, and they're having to inbreed a lot to try to rebuild the population. Well, they've gone through such a bottleneck effect that I can take blood or skin or tissue or organs from any cheetah and implant it into any other cheetah. That's strange, right? Like for humans, you can't just take organs from one person and implant them in anybody else because there's genetic differences. They would reject that foreign tissue. Well, cheetahs are so similar because of the bottleneck effect that each one can receive an organ donation or transplant from anyone else, right? So that's good in a sense, I guess. You can get organs from anybody, but that's bad in a sense that you've lost so much genetic variation, right? And that's in the big scheme of things, genetic variation, the greater the genetic variation, the greater the chance for long-term survival of any species. So bottleneck effects. So with those are the four mechanisms of evolution. And we like to point out that, yes, they have happened, they are happening, and there's just this continual process of evolution that it hasn't stopped, right? It just continues to go. We look at the idea of convergence, convergent evolution. So different species that start to converge on a similar phenotype. Right? They start to look maybe not similar, but they develop certain strategies to overcome the same physical forces. So if you're going to fly, you need some sort of wing structure, right? Well, bats, by selection, have gone through this process of forming wings. The extinct pterosaur formed wings. Modern birds form wings. So all trying to overcome the force of gravity. So convergence. Not closely related species starting to look similar. We see this again kind of with sharks and dolphins and maybe penguins starting to develop that they converge around that little torpedo-like body shape and then that little pointy snout, trying to overcome the forces of sort of swimming in cold water. Yeah? So similar environmental pressures. Comparative anatomy, well, bone structure is the same bones, but we see very different sizes, thicknesses, complexities of the bones depending on what the animal is using those parts for. So again, we have the humerus, smaller humerus, stout humerus, again, trying to serve a different purpose for the animal, right? We have very dexterous fingers, right? If you look at a horse, they don't. They have modified the same bones for very different purposes. So comparative anatomy, trying to show some of the similarities in physiology, in phylogeny, I should say. We have a certain amount of parts that we can work with. How those parts are shifted and changed and modified has a huge impact on the overall functionality of the current organism. As we progress through our embryonic stage, right, embryology, we can see then changes that take place where we progress through more primitive types of stages, like our phylogenetic ancestors would have as well. So fish, salamander, tortoise all start out looking pretty similar. They do change as they progress, but the similarities are there. Chicken and a human start out pretty similar. Over the course of development, well, we do see that, well, we're not chickens, right? We do change to human form, but we do progress through the same format that a lot of these more primitive vertebrates do. And we're going to cover that later as well when we get into the vertebrates and mammals and birds, and we'll get into some taxonomy later in the semester. So lastly here, still a few more things, but I want to kind of look at how the human body and how other organisms' body kind of serve as storage organs, storage museums, or almost. We are going to look at these ideas called vestigial structures. Vestigial kind of translates to useless, non-useful, right? Well, they seem to have no apparent function in the current organism, but they give us a little insight, the past historic potential use of that organ in a more primitive organism, right? So some examples of vestigial structures include things like the appendix, human appendix, snake tibial spurs, pelvic bones of the whales, human ear wiggling muscles, right? They don't have an apparent function today, but in our phylogenetic past, they might have been quite useful. So again, the human appendix today has no real apparent function, but maybe in our primate ancestors, maybe it was a different diet that they were eating. Maybe it did serve some sort of beneficial role. If you know something about snakes, snakes are basically highly modified lizards. Lizards have 4 legs, they have hind legs. Well, some of these primitive snakes retain that pelvic girdle, right? They have basically the ilium, they part like a pelvis. They have the little spur, so this is sort of tracing back to the remnants of legs, right? Modern snakes don't use them, but their phylogenetic ancestors, which were the lizards, basically did, and kind of see it maybe by mutation, by selection, by gene flow, we seem to have minimized or lost then the legs. Tails in humans, right? We do have a little coccyx, right? A little tailbone, derived from some of the more primitive long tails of different vertebrates here. When you're cold, when you're scared, you develop goosebumps. Well, all of the primates do that. Other animal, most of the vertebrates also generate goosebumps to stand the fur up, to stand the feathers up, to make the bird look puffier, to make the chimp look bigger, to insulate more heat. So very useful for other species. For humans, this is not going to keep us much warmer. It's not going to make us appear much bigger, right? So we consider that a vestigial trait for humans. So I'm going to post a video on that. So look for the vestigial video. I think you might find it interesting. And then as we kind of try to summarize and finish up this this background, this sort of introduction to the themes of the course, we look at constraints on evolution. Right? So it's always been implied that sufficient genetic variation always exists for the evolution of favored traits. So like we say, well, polar bears are going extinct. We say, well, somebody says, well, they should just adapt. They adapt so they don't die out. Well, it's not always that easy, right? Cheetahs are going extinct. Well, cheetahs, why don't they just evolve, right? Well, it's not always that easy. They don't have enough genetic variation to evolve, right? So evolution is limited by a serious constraint. Evolutionary changes must be based on modifications of previously existing traits. So there must be something in the genome that can be modified. Right? So this gives us an idea of why do we have vestigial traits. We're not using that appendix now, but because we have it and because there's DNA that's coding for it, that could be modified or mutated or selected for in a future situation maybe. Yeah? So organisms cannot evolve appropriate responses to environmental stressors that they haven't encountered before. So it's going to take time for organisms to adapt, to evolve, for things to happen. And human societies are changing the environment so rapidly that a lot of these species don't have the ability to evolve quickly enough. Right? One idea is plastic. Right? Plastic has come onto the scene in a relatively short time and taken over everything, right? In the old days, all your pencils were made of wood, right? Today, now the pencils are mechanical. Think of the desks that you were in school, right? Your desks, your tables were all nice wood, oak, or cherry, whatever. Now they're probably laminate or plastic, right? So plastic has sort of come into the world in all kinds of aspects, right? And a lot of these organisms are evolved and adapted to eating other things. They eat plastics by accident because maybe they're not that intelligent. A plastic bag floating in the water looks like a jellyfish. Well, for millions of years, turtles have seen things floating in the water. That's food, right? So things are changing rapidly for these organisms in their natural environments. So what happens at this point, right? Either they continue eating the wrong things and dying, or they learn. There's a learning process where they stop eating these things, or maybe they start to develop some mutation in stomach acid that enables them to digest these things, or certain bacteria now evolve to to decompose plastic, because plastic, and once plastic is made, it stays on planet Earth, right? Once it's made into that format, we're dealing with all kinds of plastic pollution throughout the planet, and it is going to have a long-term impact on many, many species. So we'll end this thing here, right? So whether you feel like you are or not, you are a major influencer on evolution, right? So humans are changing the environment. The fact that you're just breathing, right? You're breathing, you're taking in oxygen, you're releasing CO2, right? So we're having an impact, an ecological impact on the world around us, right? And many species can't evolve appropriate responses quickly enough and are going extinct. So humans need resources, right? We need food, we need space. So we are making a very, very major impact on the planet Earth, right? So many species are rapidly adapting, right? Things like bacteria, cockroaches, pigeons, ooh, they like humans. You know, these organisms thrive. Humans are very messy, very destructive species. There's some species that benefit, right? There's other species that are very harmed by that destruction. So again, it's not all good, it's not all bad. It's, you know, if we look at this objectively, just, you know, we are making things really good for some species, we're making things very difficult for others. So by humans, hybridization, by the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms, we're creating new genetic sequences on planet Earth that potentially are being procreated artificially or released back into wild, and in natural selective processes are changing the dynamics of these wild populations. So just understand, evolution is not something that's happening way over there and humans have no influence on that. Yes, we are, you know, very ecologically integrated with everything that's happening, you know, in our local community, but also elsewhere, right? Think of the products that you buy, the things that you eat. You know, if you eat fish, if you're a fish seafood lover, well, I suspect you didn't catch that fish locally, right? All that had to have been captured somewhere else and shipped here. So we are a piece of the big puzzle, right? And having an impact directly or indirectly on this whole biosphere that we call Earth. So with that, we'll conclude this discussion. I know you gotta get working on your exam there. So that should be enough to get you all the information that you would need then to answer the last questions on that exam, right? So with that, let me get this converted and posted so you can have it available.